Well, welcome to another episode of Rimshots with Sean, brought to you by Barstools and Bandtalk. And this gentleman had a post a couple weeks ago that actually made me laugh and made me cry at the same time, and I had to reach out to him. We have the one, the only Mr. Ken Mary. How you doing, sir?
Good. How are you today?
I'm doing great. So the post was basically, you said some young buck had made some joke about a grandfather playing double kick drum or something, and I'm paraphrasing. Your reaction to it was actually very funny. But I was thinking, like, what a crappy thing to say. I mean, like, you wouldn't chirp Bill Ward. I wouldn't chirp, you know what I mean? So just your
I
thoughts
def
on that. You took it quite well.
well, actually, when I first saw it, actually, his response was, "This is what happens when your dad gets a hold of your double bass pedal," and uh, and I actually thought it was pretty funny. Like I did laugh, and then I thought about it, and I just went, "What would possess somebody to like say something on like my page? Like for the person to say that on my page, it's like that's a pretty ballsy move. It's like." I'm not sure why people feel free enough to say things like that, and I think it's actually kind of a problem with our society in general that people feel maybe a little bit too free to say what they're feeling, especially when it's negative. I mean, I guess in the days before social media, you'd only hear the positives. You'd only hear people that were excited about your music or about your work. Now I guess you hear about people that aren't necessarily excited about it, but it just seems weird to me that if you don't have something nice to say, why would you say anything? It's like I would never go to somebody's page, especially, if I didn't like their music or whatever, or it wasn't my cup of tea. I'm not going to sit there and bag on it for no reason. So yeah, I was a little surprised by that, but that's the day and age we live in.
It is. And, there's a great meme out there. It's Mike Tyson. And basically the paraphrase of that is, social media is giving people the ability to be confident enough that they can say what they want and not get punched in the face. So that's kind of where we're at with all this whole thing now, right?
Yep, I think he's pretty accurate with that. Yep.
So, and I'm gonna say, I grew up listening to you. Now, I mean, I don't want you to think that, oh my God, you're like 70 years old, like this guy said. I mean, I'm 53, right? So I'm probably not that much younger than you are. But my first experience with seeing you was at the Halifax Metro Center. You were playing with Alice Cooper, I do believe it was the first time. And we're sitting right in the lower bowl, but on the end of the bowl that goes around like this. And my guitar player sitting next to me. What the heck is going on there over the drummer's head? We had binoculars, and you were chucking the stick up about 40 feet in the friggin' air, grabbing it, playing it. It was the first time I'd actually seen, I guess, a drummer do any sort of showy type stuff. Was that always part of your repertoire when you're playing? Obviously, you get chops galore, but that was always something that you maybe had put in there to do.
Yeah, I mean, I've always felt like, I if I was at a show, I want to see something exceptional, and I mean, that was about, while you're playing drums and being the foundation of the music. I mean, you have to do something that you can still be the foundation of the music with, and so that's always the challenge. The challenge is, make sure that you can do what you're doing and still keep everything, keep the groove moving smoothly. But yeah, that's something I always wanted to do, was to, give people something to look at. It's like most drummers, and I'm not, there's nothing wrong with it, but if you're just sitting there playing the groove, that doesn't necessarily give people in an arena something to look at. So that was always the goal.
Um, so I mean, and I mentioned Alice Cooper, but your resume is vast. I mean, like that's one of many things you've done. Certainly, I know you have through House of Lords. When I saw your socials, I had no idea the Flotsam and Jetsam thing. I mean, that's So for anybody that's going to sit there and say, oh, your grandfather's double kick drum. I mean, come on, that's a pretty legit.
Well, all I can say is, I'd like the guy that said that to play "Blood in the Water" and post it online, and let's see how that works out for him.
Right. So that's what I'm saying. So what
No,
the
I mean, that's the whole thing. Like, I know it's a ridiculous statement and everything, but it's still the thing that's bothersome is just what would possess somebody to feel compelled to do that on your page. It's very odd. I think Mike Tyson had it right though.
Yeah, and it's to your point, I see that a lot. Where one of the things that I talked about it on my own page last week, where you post, I'm playing this gig, and somebody posts, oh well, I can't make it, but I'm playing here, and I start at 7 o'clock. And if you get like, it's just everybody just feels the need to self promote and intrude all the time, and it's rude for starters, very poor etiquette, but it doesn't really bode well to being, I guess, community team player. I guess is the only way I can describe it.
Absolutely.
Right. So talk about your background for a little bit, Ken. I mean, you've played with a lot of people. You've done a lot of recording. You've done a lot of things. Just give us, I guess, a soup to nuts of where you started and where you are now.
Wow, soup to nuts. That's a little bit tough because a lot of times, I mean, I'm not being facetious here. I'm actually being kind of serious. There's a lot of stuff in my history, and I tend to not keep super close track of it. But I'd say some of the big things. I started out touring with a guitarist named Randy Hansen who did a Jimi Hendrix tribute, and that was fantastic experience. I was a teenager, and that's really how I got the Alice gig. I was touring with Randy, and I played the Whiskey a Go Go, which is a very famous club in Los Angeles where everybody has played, from Van Halen to Kiss to, like, you name it. Everybody's played the Whiskey a Go Go, and I was playing there, and some people from Alice's management company showed up, and or they were working with Alice's management company, and they said, "Hey, did you want to audition, for Alice's band?" And I said, "Of course." At the time, I was living in Seattle, and it was actually a lot of money for me to, at that point, to take a gamble and go, yeah, fly me, I'll fly down for the audition and everything. And but I did. They had 3 days of auditions, and I ended up getting that gig. And so next thing I know, the biggest place I think I'd played prior to Alice was, I think, probably about 3,500 people, the Paramount Theater in Seattle, Washington. And then all of a sudden, 5 days into the tour, we're playing Joe Louis Arena, 22,000 seats, sold out in Detroit, live on MTV in front of 20 million people. And, it was just, I was a pig in slop. I mean, it was like, I was completely built for that moment, had a blast, had a killer time. After that, I joined House of Lords. We had a pretty good run there. And I got to work with Gene Simmons, who was a big influence on me, one of my childhood idols. Kiss was the first concert I ever saw, so I got a chance to work closely with Gene. I really enjoyed that. I think Gene's I've heard a lot of different things about Gene, but my experience was very positive. I found him to be very honest and forthright, and good businessman, and really easy to work with. I got to work with, let's see, I'm just trying to think. There was also Fifth Angel, which was my high school band, which got signed to Epic. That was in that same period. I played with a bunch of art guitarists like Dave Chastain and Chris Impellitteri, who's in the Metal Hall of Fame now. I did 6 records with him. Did some records with, I did a record with Don Dokken. I did some recordings with Kip Winger. These are obviously platinum artists. I did a record with Jordan Rudess, who's the keyboard player from Dream Theater. I'm just trying to think of some. I don't want to leave anybody out here, but I'm going to leave out a lot of stuff. Obviously, Flotsam and Jetsam. I mentioned Fifth Angel. I'm sure I'm leaving out tons of stuff. I was actually I was on 3. The most important thing in my career, actually, it's almost not a joke, but I was on Full House for 3 episodes. I was in Jesse and the Rippers. So they say once a Ripper, always a Ripper. So I was on 3 episodes of Full House when it was the #1 television show the number 1 TV show in the United States. And what's funny about that is, out of all the touring I've done, touring with Alice and touring with House of Lords and touring with Flotsam and playing, big, huge events and all that stuff, more people saw me on Full House than saw me on everything else combined, because at the time it was the #1 show in the nation. I think it had 80 million households watching or something like that. So it's just really funny, you do something that's kind of, not that it was a joke, it was actually very nice. John Stamos asked me to be on the show, and he's a drummer as well. And so he saw me play at the Palace Theater in Los Angeles and wanted me to be on the show. So that was, a great experience. I'm just trying to think. I'm sure I'm leaving out a whole bunch of stuff, but I guess that's probably enough, right? Oh, I could tell you about the different producers I worked with. I worked with a couple of iconic producers that for me were very special. I learned most of what I know from producing wise from Michael Wagner, who is a incredible engineer producer, and he produced bands like, oh, I don't know, Metallica, Megadeth, Ozzy Osbourne. The list goes on and on. I mean, he sold 60 million albums, I think, over his career. So I got the chance to work with him. Oh, Bonfire, that's another record I played on that went gold in Germany. Sorry. Some of the other producers, Mac, who produced Queen, did some records with him. Fabulous guy. Worked with Terry Brown, who is of Rush fame. He produced all my favorite Rush albums. He did the second Fifth Angel album, so I got an opportunity to work with him, which was fantastic. I did 2 albums with Andy Johns, who produced a little band called Led Zeppelin. Actually, he was the engineer on that. I think Jimmy Page was the producer, and but Andy was the engineer on all that stuff, and he was responsible for room miking on drums. I mean, he's like, if you listen to Led Zeppelin and you listen to drummers recorded before Led Zeppelin, nobody was using room mics. And he actually started putting room mics in and putting heavy amounts of compression. So doing a couple records with Andy was amazing. He generally hated drummers.
Yes.
Because he was he fired, famous people. I think he fired Kazi Powell. I think he fired like a bunch of famous guys because I know what he was looking for. He was looking, people thought he was nuts, but he was looking for a groove. He was looking for time and groove. And he wanted to hear that snare drum just laid back a little bit. And I could do that pretty easily. So he loved me and I loved working with him. So that was like kind of a highlight of my career. He got me in a headlock one time and he's like, you and Bonham, man. He's like, 6'4". He's like this huge guy. And he had me in a headlock. And he's like, you and Bonham, man, you and Bonham. And I was like, I'll never forget that, ever. I mean, that's something I'm going to carry with me all my life. It's like just to be mentioned in the same breath was like, wow, by the guy that recorded him. I was just like, whoa, this is pretty trippy stuff. And then, of course, working with Gene was amazing too. First concert I ever saw, and then working closely with him was really, an incredible experience. So, over the years, I mean, that's just again a small snippet. I'm leaving out tons of amazing producers that I've worked with, but that's just a little snippet into some of the things that have meant something to me over my career.
I'm always fascinated to talk to people that have vast CVs and have played with multiple acts, right? Because it's like, the 2 schools of thought is, one, that's the career that you've chosen, that's what you want to do, or B, you're the guy that is maybe easy to get along with and does what is needed and gets the call. And where do you fit in, and how has it that you've just stayed active? Is there something that you're doing that maybe other people aren't?
I'm not sure, to be honest with you. I think a lot of this business just has to do with, I mean, I think you're right. I mean, I think you have to be somewhat easy to work with. I'm not really sure when I was younger, I was necessarily the easiest to work with. But I think back then we didn't have Pro Tools. I mean, now you have Pro Tools and Beat Detective and Elastic Audio. And, as a producer, I can make drummers that aren't necessarily very good sound like drumming, gods with a small G there, but, make them sound, incredible. And so, back in the day when we were doing, records on 2-inch tape, you had to actually be able to play and adjust for producers. Like there were producers I worked with that said, hey, can you play ahead of the click, or can you play behind the click, or can you play right on the click? And I could do all of those things. So for me, it was it was more of I think it was a function of back in that era before Beat Detective and before Pro Tools allowed sort of like, I mean, now you can, if you have a moderately good drummer, you can end up with an amazing sounding drum track. Back in that day, you couldn't. And so I did get a lot of calls, and I replaced a lot of, people that the names of. So,
well, and and it's interesting that you mentioned that, right? Because you hear of things that have come out years later where, Picaro played on something or he played on something and,
Yeah.
the Steely Dan guys decided to get Bernard Purdy. And, Jeff has actually said that in a number of interviews, but that probably happened more often than not where there was uncredited performances. And hopefully people get paid when they did those uncredited performances. But
Well, you get paid for it. It's not a question of getting paid, but you do have to. The idea is you're ghosting, on a particular project, and you're to be the ghost. You are to be the unnamed, person. So back in that day, I played on a tremendous amount of material, and I think it was largely because, especially with a click track, I was very adept. I was very skilled at using it as a tool, but not being locked to it. And a lot of drummers, I mean, even when they could play to a click, they might not necessarily have good feel because they weren't really comfortable with it. I mean, I really was comfortable with the click track. I used it a lot. Growing up, I had a drum machine. I was a little bit more almost from this type of era. Like if you watch Instagram now, you're going to watch drummers that grew up, playing with click tracks, and they play in their bands with click tracks. And, everybody's doing that now. But back in the day, nobody was really doing it. And I was doing it. And I think it did definitely, it did give me a huge advantage. And I think that honestly, that's probably why I was called up for so many albums, was just the fact that, A, I was fairly easy to work with, but B, I think I could accomplish what needed to be accomplished and do it in sorry,
that's all
and
right.
do it in a very expedient manner, because back then, the other thing was, how much studio time cost back then. We were paying maybe $2,000 a day to be in a really nice studio, and to track drums. And I would do whole albums in, sometimes as little as 1 day or 2 days, or depending on what the schedule was and how fast they needed it. I was able to really knock stuff out fairly quickly and cost effectively, which I think was another, important reason why I would get the calls from a lot of producers.
So I mean, the vault is a vault. I would never say, "Hey, Ken, tell me who." But what I would say is, has that ever put you in a situation where you did a track for somebody that you knew and maybe they weren't too happy about it? Not that they were mad at you, but you were just the guy that got called in. Has that ever you been ever put in that position before?
Well, I was called into one weird position, and I think I could probably talk about it now. I'm not sure what happened with the drummer, but when I was called in to play on a record called Bonfire, this was a band out of Germany, and my friend Michael Wagner called me in to play on that album. We had recently worked on the Alice Cooper Raise Your Fist and Yell album, and he was very happy with how those drum tracks came out. And I guess they were starting work on the new Bonfire record and it wasn't working. And so he just called me up and said, "Hey, I need you to come in and play on this." And I was, yeah, absolutely. Of course they pay you for it as well. But, he wanted me to come down and play, and the drummer was there at the sessions. And, and Michael told the drummer, "Yeah, Ken's going to, play on the album." And I'm just like going, it's a weird situation to walk into, as a player. You're going like, okay, because I felt bad for the drummer, and I don't know exactly what happened, or maybe he just wasn't able to record in at the level that needed to be done or whatever. But that was kind of weird. It's weird when you're tracking drums and for a project, and the drummer in the band is in the control room. It's a little odd.
That would be strange. But I mean, here's the thing too. I mean, and you mentioned Michael Wagner and you mentioned a couple other folks. And I mean, I've read things where producers have drummers that they like to work with. And Andy Johns, Cozy Powell would be, I think Denny Carmassi was a guy that Andy Johns used to call in for different things too. Producers get familiar with guys because they show up, they're prepared, they know what they're gonna get. Hey, Ken Mary's going to show up. He's not going to, dog us here for one drum track's not going to take 10 hours. So that's probably what the reputation becomes. Is that a fair statement?
I think it's probably a fair statement. And I do agree with you. I think especially in that position, I mean, drums, especially in that era, were the foundation of the rest of the record. So if you had a weak drum track, there's really nothing you could really do to fix it, and it would affect the entire record. That's why guys like Jeff Porcaro and so many studio drummers had a real thing going in that era. And Pro Tools, I think, has been a double-edged sword. I think in some instances it's been a great thing. I think for singers it's kind of a horrible thing, because now with auto tune and editing, you can make singers sound pretty good that maybe aren't necessarily that good, and then you see them live and you're like, hey, what happened to this person? And same thing with drummers and guitar players. Like, I just think it's certainly nice in the fact that you're able to get some great performances from people that maybe otherwise wouldn't be able to provide them. But it did lessen the value of what guys like Jeff Porcaro did, and maybe what I did, and some other session type of players. I think it did lessen that value quite a bit. Like, obviously I'm not doing as many records now as I was back in the day. So I kind of look at it as like a double-edged sword. As a producer, I enjoy having the tools to be able to really affect the outcome of a record. And as a musician, it's kind of irritating that you spend so long of your life really developing your craft and being good at it, and then there's a machine that can kind of be an equalizer and take somebody that's maybe not all that good, and they're playing at the same level that you are, just because now you have a machine that can adjust that and make them sound perfect.
Sure. There's a question I've never asked anybody this before, and I don't expect you to say it's this, but oftentimes I hear things about people, they get asked to do either live shows or studio time, and they're nervous about their rate. So it's kind of like, what do I charge? What's my rate? And it becomes a very, some people do it for free. Why they would do it, that I don't know. But in terms of rate, were you always comfortable with, this is what it is, this is what I want, if I don't get it, thanks much for the opportunity? But is that pretty much how you've always looked at it, or are you flexible with that? Because I think this could help some folks that are maybe trying to do it a little bit.
Sure. Well, back in the day, I was definitely somewhat flexible. Like, the big determining factor would be what was the budget on the record. And if the budget, was over $100,000, then, yeah, I'd feel totally comfortable charging, my normal rate. And if it was on, like maybe it's $50,000 or maybe it's $30,000. And back in those days, like the first Fifth Angel album that was signed to Epic Records, I think we spent in 1985 dollars, I think it was about $10,000, maybe a little more than $10,000. So, I mean, in today's money, that's probably about 30 some $1,000s in today's money. And so, but that was a very, efficient, tight record in terms of, trying to make a great album for a very limited budget. And so most of the things that I was playing on, I mean, some of the Chastain stuff were, very tight budgets. Any of the Shrapnel record stuff, were very tight budgets. Usually any of the major label stuff, if it was Epic Records or MCA or RCA or, any of that, then usually it was, you could charge your normal rate and it wasn't a problem. So I don't know, did that help?
No, absolutely it did. Because I think some people, they're all well and good till they have to start talking about money, right? And it's like, it's like getting paid if you're playing a wedding and you're asking for money at the end. It's like, you should never be ashamed, because you've done the work to get to that point. You've been hired. It's not a invasive thing. It's a business arrangement, and shouldn't feel bad asking, right?
Well, I agree. I mean, it's like you're doing a job, you should get paid, and hopefully they're able to pay you well. And then sometimes you do run across situations where, they don't have the ability to pay. And especially in this day and age where the budgets are, insanely low compared to what they were, back in the day. Now it's like, if you had a $30,000 budget today, that's different than what it was in the past. That's actually, not necessarily a bad budget by today's standards, depending on what kind of label it is. Now, I do know that, it's also style specific, like a lot of the rock stuff, the budgets are really tight. But if you're doing, a rap or hip hop thing, the budget may be fairly expansive. So it depends on what kind of music you're into. And I'm in more of a, obviously, metal rock area. And, it's a little bit of a you have to do it because you love the art and you love the music, as opposed to, you're making a ton of money at it.
So I'd be remiss if I didn't ask this, and you mentioned, and I think I know where a lot of it's coming from, but if you go on any, and I'll say blabbermouth, it just seems like every second story is tracks. Like, oh, what are your, this person gives her 2 cents on tracks, and that person gives her 2 cents on tracks. As a drummer myself, and you mentioned it, it's a skill set to be able to do it, right? Because you got to be able to play with the click track, you got to be consistent. However, I get when people get upset when it's a lead vocal, and I saw one the other day of a famous singer. He pulled off the microphone and the vocals are still going, right? What's
That's
your
your
what's your 2 cents on tracks, and where do they fit, I guess, in today's world?
Well, honestly, you're probably not going to like my answer, but I'm okay with it depending on the artist. Like there's certain artists that, let's just face it, as a singer, there are very few singers when you get into your 70s that are going to even sound like they did back in the day. And look, I grew up hearing all the Elton John songs, and I saw some of his recent footage. He's over 70. His voice doesn't sound the same. Like, to me, it doesn't even sound like the same singer. So, if you're talking about an artist like, for instance, I saw Kiss, I saw their final, farewell tour. This is right before COVID. And I knew that some of the, vocals were on tracks. And to be honest with you, I'm okay with it because I just wanted to see him play the songs. I wanted to remember like the way it was when I saw him the first time I saw him. And, you wanted to, remember your childhood heroes the way they are. I'd much rather hear a track than hearing some, horrible performance or something where they're just not able to do it anymore. So I'm okay in certain instances, and I know that young people are too. I can't remember, I mean, this is probably 15 years back, but I remember talking to somebody about Britney Spears, and I was like, well, that, all that she's doing, it's all on track. And they were like, yeah, it's okay because she's dancing so much, that's okay. And I'm like, all right, well, if you know it and you're okay with it and you're just there to see the performance, I think sometimes it's okay. I think if it's something where, it's maybe a more, I don't want to say more serious kind of music, but maybe a music that it's more, I don't know, not necessarily geared as much on the show, then for that kind of thing, I would probably not be okay with lead vocals being on tracks.
Well, and I think what started it was maybe a year and a half ago. There was a band that was playing the Whiskey a Go Go. I don't know if you saw it. But all of them stepped away, and at one point the drummer wasn't even, he was standing up and the music was all still going, right? So it blew up as this big fake phony thing, and it's like, okay, maybe that's a little much. But by the same token, to your point, and especially the price of concert tickets now, man, like if you're paying $500 to go see your favorite band, like you don't want to see some guy croaking through 2 hours of music, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's one of those things. If you're not okay with it, don't go see it. Don't pay the money to go see it. And that's the whole thing. Like for me, seeing Kiss, I was aware that there was going to be some magic going on, and I was totally okay with it. Like I want to hear those songs the way they were. As if the whole thing was on tracks, then I might have a problem with that. I did hear some things about another band where supposedly the whole thing was on tracks, and I'm just like, yeah, that's probably a bit much, a bit far to take it. So, I guess I'm in the middle of the argument. I think sometimes it's okay, and sometimes it's not okay. Sometimes you're going to want to see your artists, and especially if they're young and they're healthy. But when you start talking about artists that, you start getting into your late 60s or 70s, they might need a little bit of help, and now and then, maybe just on the high notes or whatever, or maybe somebody's going to sing the high part, or, and that doesn't, for me personally, it doesn't really bother me.
For sure. I'm almost at a time, but I do like to ask this question because especially for people that are musicians, when they hear this stuff, and it centers around practicing. And I've talked to some people, they practice X amount a day. I talked to other people, it's the muscle memory's there, they don't do it. You as a drummer that's been playing for obviously your whole life, what's your, I guess, value on practicing now? Are you still doing it a lot? Are you to the point where You only do it when you need to? Where do you do it?
No, I mean, I'm a big believer in practicing, every day, as long as your body is holding up. There have been times where I was injured, where I wasn't able to practice every day. And, that's obviously, very disconcerting to not be able to do that. But, if you're healthy, I mean, yeah, I think for me personally, yeah, I practice every day. I mean, I think it's very important, on a number of levels. I mean, if you're trying to be great at something, you want it to be second nature. And I know that, for instance, Eddie Van Halen, when he was young, he was sleeping with his guitar, and eating with his guitar on, and his guitar was constantly there. And it's like, I think that's, you become one with the instrument to some degree. And I think part of that is just the effort that you put into it. I mean, yeah, if you're practicing every day, I think you're going to see a big difference over those people that practice, once a week, or, whenever they feel like it. I think especially drums, guitar, vocals. I mean, if you're talking about a specific, specifically in metal and rock, in that genre, I just think it's a world of difference between the people that practice every day and those that don't.
Amen. Amen. I'm a big believer, because if you like something, you don't, sometimes it's work, but very, very little it's work. It's a joy to do it, right? Last question. So what's going on with Ken Mary? Where can my viewers find out what's going on with you over the next bit, and tune in and support?
Sure. Well, we just released a double vinyl, Fifth Angel album. It's called When Angels Kill, and it's out on Nuclear Blast Records, which is one of the premier metal labels in Europe, and doing well. And it's a concept record. It actually wraps up all of the subject matter from the first three albums into a very interesting story. And so I'm very proud of that record. That's out now. We're working on a new Flotsam record. We're going to be doing some touring coming up here in a couple months, and that's really what I have on the horizon. I also am playing some shows with Great White, and I'm flying out this weekend to play some shows with that band, and excuse me, Jack Russell's Great White.
Right.
And so that's is that enough stuff?
That's a lot, man. Though, and you know what, my viewers are very good at going out and looking for things. So, I want to thank you very much for doing this, sir. And like I say, you've always been somebody that I've totally enjoyed listening to. And again, this all started with that little post on social media, which oddly enough, I was kind of, you see these young kids that are doing things like they invented it, and they don't necessarily go back and find out who came before them. And I just thought it was a beautiful post, and I want to do this. So thanks so much.
Well, thanks so much, Sean. And then I guess maybe can we get off the recording and then talk about that ferry ride to Halifax? Because I
Absolutely, we will, brother.
All right.
We'll talk soon.
All right.
Get married, kids.